Welcome to the Unveiled Epoch Echoes channel. Today, we're diving deep into an unexplored historical mystery. I will tell a shorter, quietly measured account here instead of an enormous volume, and I will fold into that account the slow, steady particulars of a town so ordinary that its ordinariness itself might be considered remarkable. And then, as gently as a clock's second hand, I will guide you through the town's ordinary days after the town council passed a law recommending, and then that everyone take a nap at 3 in the afternoon. A law that read like a polite suggestion on paper and settled into the town like dust into the corners of a seldom-used room, and everyone adjusted in small, inattentive ways, while the world outside the town remained as it had been, indifferent and distant. The town was the sort that people described by pointing to a map and saying, "There it is, where the houses slope, and the roads have names you recognize, because you've driven them a dozen times, where the main street still has a hardware store with a bell above the door, and a post office with 2 working windows, and the postmaster who seldom looked in a hurry. And here, in this small geography of porches and painted mailboxes and sidewalks that faintly with afternoon heat in summer, they gathered a town meeting one Tuesday evening because that was what towns did when they had something new to discuss, and the mayor, who kept his notes on index cards and folded them like paper boats, read the resolution out loud with a voice that rose and fell in a rhythm everyone in the room had come to trust, and the resolution said, in plain words, that at 3 p.m. each weekday the town would observe a pause for a nap, that municipal services would slacken gently rather than stop, that businesses were encouraged to dim lights or draw shades and allow patrons the quiet allowance of a short rest, and that the ordinance was to take effect on the first Monday of the next month, which everyone checked on a calendar in the back of the meeting hall. The paper calendar that hung by a thumbtack and had little coffee stains around the edges where people leaned closer to see the dates because they found it pleasant to read. After the vote, which was unanimous save for a single abstention from a man who worked 2 jobs and smiled politely, the council minutes were typed up by the clerk in neat, unhurried sentences, and someone made coffee at the back of the hall, while the janitor closed a cupboard door with a slow, final sound that resonated through the small room, and then people drifted home thinking about nothing in particular, which was how most decisions in that town sank into life. Quietly, without fanfare, like the soft settling of leaves in a yard in late October. For the first few days, the naps were formal in the way a new habit is. The library posted a small sign on the inside of its front window with a printed clock face showing the hands at 3, and the librarian folded a blanket onto the reading chair by the big window that caught the low light of late afternoon, and sometimes, when the sun lay just right, the dust motes looked like slow planets making their rounds, and patrons came to the library and left books on tables, and then reclined for short rests. Lids of eyes lowering over the gentle rustle of pages, and the faint tick of the grandfather clock in the corner, which the librarian wound on Tuesdays after she checked the appointments for book clubs that met in the basement and the quilting circle that met on Thursdays, and the clock, like many things in town, kept to its unremarkable duty. The diner on Main, a rectangle of counter stools and vinyl booths that had been there longer than most of the patrons, arranged a placard with hours and a small handwritten note that said, 3 p.m. quiet hour, in the same ink the owner used for grocery lists, and the cook continued to flip pancakes and pour coffee and watch through the steam as regulars lowered into a soft stupor in the booths, the radio playing a station that announced the weather with an even, unexcited cadence. And the bell over the door jingled occasionally for those who had appointments and occasionally did not, because people sometimes walked in to get a sandwich and stayed to sleep for a half-hour beside the window where the sun warmed the vinyl. The school adopted the nap law in the way institutions make small accommodations. Teachers set aside part of the day, prepared mats stacked quietly in a supply closet, and the students, who had once been more energetic, found they liked the idea of a short lull after lunch, a time to fold their hands and close their eyes, and the classroom clock counted down in slow, patient circles while crayons rested on paper and chalk lay mid-letter on the blackboard. And when 3 came, they lay with their heads on their arms or on pillows that smelled faintly of detergent. And some of the younger children drifted into nap-time breathing that was slow and regular and reassuring in its peacefulness. And it all took place with the same gentle lack of ceremony as filling pies with fruit or sweeping the steps in front of the church. City workers adjusted their routes with the same unobtrusive care. The trash collectors who began a little earlier in the morning so they could pause at 3 on cooler days. The mail carrier who took a bench break under a tree near the library and let the letters rest on her lap for a few quiet minutes as if she too were a book needing a bookmark. And the municipal clerk who left her desk light dimmer and let the keyboard click slowly, letters appearing in the minute packing of someone who is not in a hurry. There was no enforcement arm. The law had no patrols, no fines, because the town believed in mutual trust the way it believed in the reliability of the bridge over creek that had been repaired twice in living memory and held steady. And so the nap hour became a social custom carried by the gentle inertia of habit, rather than a strict rule enforced by any formal hand. In the weeks after the law, it was notable how often the matter of not setting an alarm itself became a small joke said in passing. Someone would smile and remark that no one had remembered to set an alarm, and the smile said both that it did not matter and that it might be amusing, and then the conversation would move on to weather and the slow progress of a neighbor's hedge. Clocks in living rooms showed 3 with hands that advanced as they always had, sometimes with an audible tick, sometimes with the softer, steadier movement of a newer clock, and people let their attention slip away into the low edge of sleep without the sting of panic that an alarm implies. Some would nod in chairs by windows while sunlight crawled slowly across their laps, and later retired, still warm from a faint nap, to put the kettle on or to write a note that they left half finished on the kitchen table. The post office windows would close for 15 minutes, and the clerk would take a cup of tea that steamed gently in the shape of slow exhalations, while customers who had come for stamps sometimes fell asleep on the bench under the federal poster about the importance of proper return addresses, and the bench held them like a small harbor until the clerk awoke and reset the sign to say "open" again. In the factory at the edge of town, the machines that had always drone-sung to themselves allowed a pause, the foreman shutting a padlock on a small control panel while the assembly line slowed to a softer hum, and workers, their caps still on, took short rests leaning against crates or sitting with heads bent. And when they rose, they did so without ceremony and with a steady, practiced ease, as if a brief vacation from their attention were a necessary note in the score of a day. The city council's minutes reflected these adjustments in a ledger of small facts. The hours changed by 15 minutes here and there to accommodate an older person's bus schedule. The library asked for 1 more blanket. The police chief suggested that officers might rotate shade-watching duties so none were left in direct sun for too long. These were the kinds of amendments that appear in minutes because they are reliable, because they help people keep doing what they do in a way that is easier. Nights in the town had their predictable round. Streetlights lit with a modest competence, curtains drawn, low televisions murmuring in a half-doze in living rooms where someone might always be knitting another scarf. And in the morning the town washed its face with ritual smallness. Newspapers folded at porches, coffee brewing with normal stubbornness. Dogs led on regular walks that made the same circuit and found the same things to sniff. Whispers of older histories threaded the town like the faint pattern in wallpaper, hardly noticed until someone else pointed it out. In the corner of the town park lay a stone that had been found many years ago by workmen digging for a foundation and placed on the edge of the path because no one wanted to throw it away. And on it were markings weathered almost into nothing that a high school history teacher once suggested might be older than the town itself. Perhaps the mark of someone who had passed through long before, or perhaps only the random scratches of a distant tool. And the teacher made a small note of the local law and wrote an essay about it that was read slowly by students who liked to imagine the past as a set of quiet rooms, and yet that stone did not erupt into consequence. It lay and collected moss and small bird droppings, and was visited sometimes by children who liked to see whether the patterns looked like anything at all at 3 in the afternoon, when the light hit it in a certain forgiving way. There were other things. An old ledger in the bank's basement, recording the names of families who had built the first houses, and the sum of small transactions that had seemed enormous to their authors and ordinary to later account keepers. Photographs in the town museum showing broad hats and one-lane roads, and a train that passed through and did not stop, and a carved wooden chair in the upstairs room of the antique shop that someone insisted had been made by a craftsman whose family had emigrated long ago. But none of these things created drama. They were gentle presences, like furniture left in a room because it has always had a place. People adapted by degrees and in ways that suited them. Some embraced the nap hour with a deliberate ritual of tea and closing shutters. Others kept working and simply allowed their hands to move a little more slowly. And some simply sat with the knowledge of the time tucked in like a bookmark and never quite used it. The rhythm the town made was a low, repeating pattern. Days threaded into each other like a low hum that the ears come to stop noticing, and that unremarkable continuity was what made the law feel neither oppressive nor trivial, but rather like a small, warm convenience, a bench under a tree on a hot day. In the town was the dry sort you might notice in the way someone would set an out-of-tune radio to play a station at 3 and call it their nap soundtrack, and the radio would hum in a voice that suggested neither mockery nor praise, only a tolerable acceptance. There was no urgency, because urgency requires a spike of feeling that is foreign to this place. Rather, there was an accumulation of small habits. The same person who always brought scones to the mechanic's shop on Tuesdays left them on the counter at 3, and then sat on a crate and closed his eyes for a few minutes while the radio played a simple, unpressured tune, and the mechanic put tools down without comment and rested his head against the wall. Over months, the nap hour became part of the town's architecture. It was as if a shallow groove had been worn into the day itself, and people's lives moved along that groove with an ease that felt inevitable only because it had no other competing force. The town's hidden stories, which were not the sort to cause headlines, but the kind to be whispered in calm tones over tea, were those small discoveries that fit into life rather than upend it. A faded letter found in the back of a desk that mentioned a road that was later rerouted for reasons no one could recall clearly. An old tin that contained buttons from uniforms of a time when uniforms were simpler, and people's expectations of life were flatter and less complicated, and a photograph tucked into a book that showed a group of faces with expressions that were mild and composed, and might have been the faces of anyone you passed on Main Street. And these quietly suggested that the town had always been built of small, forgettable decisions that added up to a shape you could not perceive if you only looked once. In winter, the town's nap hour had a particular softness, as snow fell in harmless flakes that did not threaten but only softened sound, and the 3 o'clock pause felt like a folded blanket across the day. People left small bowls of warm broth on porches for birds, and the sound of a neighbor's radio seeping through a wall was a companionable thing, as was the hush of children who had been coaxed into stillness by a story read in a voice so low it might have been a chant. Spring returned with its usual carelessness, and the nap law continued, as laws do, to be most notable when newly discussed, and less notable after it had been performed and performed again. Sometimes, on slow afternoons, two old friends would meet on the bench by the library and say nothing for several minutes. And in that silence, there was a kind of mutual accounting that didn't count anything but still made the time feel full. The bench took their weight, and the sun found their heads, and the town's clock moved around its face with patient, unremarked professionalism. The law that required the nap at 3 had no inspection schedule, no forms to fill out beyond the clerk's occasional note that the town hall would close for 15 minutes, and so the practice endured and softened into the background of people's days, like a that fades into the wallpaper. And the town, which had once been mentioned only in passing as a spot on a map, became in its own way a steady thing, a place where time was measured in small, reassuring ways. The bell at the Methodist church that rang the hour with benevolent accuracy, the streetlights that came on a little later each evening in summer, the wastebasket outside the grocery store into which people dropped receipts and small, carelessly folded papers that some weeks later fell apart into anonymity. This is not to say nothing of interest exists in such a town. Rather, the interesting thing is the persistence of sameness, the way people cultivate a life of gentle repetition, and how even their mysteries are the slow kind that do not startle, but only invite you to look twice, and then once more at your leisure, like a key left on a hook that you might notice tomorrow. So the town moves forward, not in bursts or sweeps, but in a steady, almost sleepy procession of days, with clocks that tick, chairs that creak, papers that rest untouched for a while and then are attended again without urgency, and with people who sometimes remember to set an alarm and sometimes do not, and find that it does not much matter either way, because the nap hour, whether observed in the strict letter of the ordinance or only as a cultural courtesy, becomes simply another thing the town does, as sure and unobtrusive as rain on a tin roof. The afternoons continue, and the town keeps its small, unassuming secrets folded within the ordinary objects of life, and though a storyteller might be tempted to pry one loose and make it into an adventure, this account resists such temptation and remains content to be a soft, long observation of nothing sudden, of no great reveal, and of slow, regular time. The history of the town continued in the same unhurried way it always had, with days stacking gently on top of one another like folded laundry that no one felt compelled to put away right away. And after the nap law had been in place long enough that people stopped talking about it, the record of those days settled into ledgers, habits, and half-remembered anecdotes told without emphasis. Old municipal files showed that the town had once debated other small ordinances with the same careful slowness, including a discussion in the 1930s about whether benches should face east or west to better catch the afternoon light, and another in the 1950s about repainting street signs a slightly darker green so they would fade more gracefully over time. And these documents were kept in filing cabinets that opened with a soft scrape and smelled faintly of paper and dust. Where clerks sometimes paused at 3 in the afternoon, hands resting on manila folders, eyes drifting shut for a moment before continuing. Long before the nap law, before even the paved roads and the diner stools, there had been quieter histories layered beneath the soil, the kind that did not announce themselves loudly, but lingered in place names, and in the way certain paths curved instead of running straight, following routes first worn by footsteps rather than planning boards. And the town's residents knew that the land had once belonged to people whose names were now mostly written only in careful, cursive on plaques that few stopped to read. Plaques that warmed in the sun at 3 p.m., while shadows from nearby trees moved slowly across the engraved letters. A local historian who worked part-time at the museum and part-time at the hardware store had once written a modest booklet about these earlier days, noting how seasonal rhythms governed life more than clocks ever had, and how midday rest was once a necessity rather than a policy. And this booklet sat on a shelf near the register, its pages occasionally thumbed through by customers who then set it down and forgot it on the counter as the nap hour approached. As the years passed, the nap law remained officially on the books, referenced once a year at council meetings, mostly as a reminder to renew signage or adjust hours slightly. And each time it was mentioned, the discussion moved slowly, punctuated by sips of water, the scrape of chairs, and the steady hum of the ceiling fan that turned with patient consistency above the meeting room. New generations grew up knowing the pause at 3 as a given, something like the way the train no longer came through or the way the creek rose a little every spring, and they accepted it without question, stretching out on couches, classroom floors, or library chairs, letting their thoughts loosen and blur while the sun angled itself differently through the same familiar windows. Even when the wider world seemed to hurry past, bringing new technologies and ways of speaking, the town absorbed them at its own pace, setting phones face down during the nap hour, letting screens dim on their own, and allowing silence to reassert itself in small, persistent ways. And so the history of the town did not build toward any defining moment or revelation, but instead widened quietly, incorporating the nap law as just another layer, another footnote in the long, slow record of people choosing rest over urgency. And as afternoons continued to arrive and pass without alarms, the town carried on, unchanged in spirit, letting time move forward calmly, steadily, and without any particular need to notice. The history of the town continued in the same unhurried way it always had, with days stacking gently on top of one another like folded laundry that no one felt compelled to put away right away. And after the nap law had been in place long enough that people stopped talking about it, the record of those days settled into ledgers, habits, and half-remembered anecdotes told without emphasis. Old municipal files showed that the town had once debated other small ordinances with the same careful slowness, including a discussion in the 1930s about whether benches should face east or west to better catch the afternoon light, and another in the 1950s about repainting street signs a slightly darker green so they would fade more gracefully over time. And these documents were kept in filing cabinets that opened with a soft scrape and smelled faintly of paper and dust. Where clerks sometimes paused at 3 in the afternoon, hands resting on manila folders, eyes drifting shut for a moment before continuing. Long before the nap law, before even the paved roads and the diner stools, there had been quieter histories layered beneath the soil, the kind that did not announce themselves loudly, but lingered in place names, and in the way certain paths curved instead of running straight, following routes first worn by footsteps rather than planning boards. And the town's residents knew that the land had once belonged to people whose names were now mostly written only in careful, cursive on plaques that few stopped to read. Plaques that warmed in the sun at 3 p.m., while shadows from nearby trees moved slowly across the engraved letters. A local historian who worked part-time at the museum and part-time at the hardware store had once written a modest booklet about these earlier days, noting how seasonal rhythms governed life more than clocks ever had, and how midday rest was once a necessity rather than a policy. And this booklet sat on a shelf near the register, its pages occasionally thumbed through by customers who then set it down and forgot it on the counter as the nap hour approached. As the years passed, the nap law remained officially on the books, referenced once a year at council meetings, mostly as a reminder to renew signage or adjust hours slightly. And each time it was mentioned, the discussion moved slowly, punctuated by sips of water, the scrape of chairs, and the steady hum of the ceiling fan that turned with patient consistency above the meeting room. New generations grew up knowing the pause at 3 as a given, something like the way the train no longer came through or the way the creek rose a little every spring, and they accepted it without question, stretching out on couches, classroom floors, or library chairs, letting their thoughts loosen and blur while the sun angled itself differently through the same familiar windows. Even when the wider world seemed to hurry past, bringing new technologies and ways of speaking, The town absorbed them at its own pace, setting phones face down during the nap hour, letting screens dim on their own, and allowing silence to reassert itself in small, persistent ways. And so the history of the town did not build toward any defining moment or revelation, but instead widened quietly, incorporating the nap law as just another layer, another footnote in the long, slow record of people choosing rest over urgency. And as afternoons continued to arrive and pass without alarms, the town carried on, unchanged in spirit, letting time move forward calmly, steadily, and without any particular need to notice. The town's history went on accumulating in that same soft, nearly weightless manner, where events were less like milestones and more like the gradual rounding of stones in a stream. And if anyone had tried to pinpoint when one era ended and another began, they would have found it difficult, because nothing ever quite announced itself as important. The Knapp Law quietly entered old newspaper archives as a short column on page 3, bordered by ads for lawn mowers and announcements about bake sales. And decades later, someone researching local ordinances would pause over it, reread the paragraph twice, and then continue without making a note, because it seemed self-explanatory and not especially remarkable. Houses aged in place, paint fading evenly on clapboard siding, porches sagging just enough to be noticed only by people who had lived there long enough to remember them straight. And inside those houses, the 3 o'clock hour remained a gentle hinge in the day, when curtains were half drawn and radios turned lower, and the sound of a spoon resting in a mug felt unusually loud. The post office replaced its old clock once, choosing a newer one that was easier to read, though it ticked more quietly, and for a while people remarked that it felt different. But after a season passed, no one remembered the old sound well enough to miss it. In the school basement, boxes of outdated textbooks were stacked beside old attendance records, and on top of one box, someone had written "Nap Mats" in pencil, the handwriting smudged from years of being brushed by passing coats. And those mats were taken out each afternoon and returned each evening with the same calm efficiency, as if they were part of the building itself rather than an object meant to be moved. The town park saw little change, except the slow growth of trees and the steady wearing of the footpath. And benches there continued to hold people who sat without speaking, eyes closed or half open, letting the day settle around them while distant traffic, like a faraway thought. Sometimes visitors passed through and noticed the quiet at 3, asking politely if something had closed unexpectedly, and residents would explain in plain terms, without pride or apology, and the visitors would nod and adjust, sitting down, waiting or dozing briefly, then moving on with a faint sense that they had stepped into a place where time behaved slightly differently. Records showed that businesses never suffered for the pause, though no one could say for certain why, and the explanation most often given was that people simply returned afterward and picked up where they had left off, tools in the same place, papers still arranged, conversations resuming mid-sentence as if they had merely taken a long breath. As years layered gently into decades, the Knapp Law became less a rule than a shared understanding, a quiet agreement between clocks, bodies, and sunlight. And the town's history remained one of continuity rather than change, of afternoons that arrived, softened, and passed on, leaving behind only the faint impression of rest, as the town continued living exactly as it always had, calmly, steadily, and without any real need to hurry. Time continued to move through the town in a way that felt less like progress and more like circulation, returning to the same places with slight variations that were noticed only if someone paid close attention, and most people did not feel the need to do so. The grocery store replaced its automatic doors after one winter when they stuck more often than they opened, and the new doors slid apart more quietly, which meant that during the nap hour the store felt almost sealed, aisles resting in a held breath while carts stood where they had been left and fluorescent lights at a steady, untroubled pitch. A few customers learned to time their shopping just before 3, moving slowly through produce and canned goods, and when the hour arrived they would sit on the bench by the front window, hands folded over receipts, eyelids heavy, the world narrowing gently to the rhythm of their own breathing. In the town hall, binders grew thicker with added years, spines labeled in the same plain font, and when someone flipped through them, the sound of pages turning was soft and regular, like a metronome set to a tempo no one bothered to count. The Knapp law appeared occasionally in these records as a reference point for scheduling, nothing more, and it was never amended in any meaningful way, because there was nothing about it that demanded improvement. People aged in place as well, hair turning grey at different speeds, routines simplifying rather than expanding, and the nap hour often became the most dependable part of the day, a small island of quiet that did not require planning or explanation. In medical offices, examination tables sat unused for that stretch of time, paper covers unwrinkled, charts left open to the same page, and the staff rested in break rooms where the coffee had gone lukewarm but was still drinkable if someone reached for it afterward. Outside, shadows shortened and lengthened in their predictable arc, and the town clock, which had once been the subject of a minor fundraising campaign to repair its chime, marked 3 with a sound that some heard and others did not, depending on where they were standing and how deeply they had settled into rest. Children who grew up with the nap hour carried it into adulthood without ceremony, some keeping the habit even when they moved away, pausing at 3 wherever they happened to be, not out of obligation, but because it felt familiar, like stopping at a red light, even on an empty road. Back in the town, new residents arrived occasionally and adapted quickly, learning that nothing was expected of them except patience, and they found that patience was easier here than elsewhere. Seasons turned, records accumulated, and afternoons continued to soften at the same point on the clock, the nap law existing not as a directive, but as a quiet background condition, like humidity or light, and the town remained what it had always been, a place where nothing in particular happened, and where that nothing unfolded calmly, day after day, without urgency and without end. The years continued to add themselves without insistence, each one resembling the last closely enough that they blended together in memory, and the town learned to measure its past not by dramatic changes, but by small substitutions, such as when the pharmacy replaced its wooden shelves with metal ones that were easier to clean, though they made a softer sound when pill bottles were set down during the nap hour, or when the newspaper reduced its page count and began printing on slightly thinner paper that folded more easily and lay flatter on kitchen tables as people rested with it open beside them. At 3 in the afternoon, the town still quieted in its familiar way, not because anyone checked the law or consulted a schedule, but because bodies remembered what to do, shoulders loosening, voices lowering, movements slowing to match the heat and light of the hour. In the barber shop, chairs reclined a little farther back than necessary, scissors rested in cups, and customers sometimes fell asleep mid-conversation, the barber continuing his work carefully, unbothered by the pause, knowing the talk could resume later or not at all. The bank lobby its lights slightly, and the click of the counting machine ceased for a while, leaving the faint smell of paper currency and furniture polish hanging in the air, undisturbed. At home, living rooms settled into patterns that repeated daily. A couch cushion shaped permanently by use, a blanket folded the same way, a lamp switched off by habit rather than thought, and someone sitting with eyes closed, listening to the house itself, the pipes cooling, the refrigerator humming, the floorboards responding quietly to changes in temperature. The nap hour smoothed the edges of the day, and people noticed that arguments, when they occurred at all, tended to drift apart rather than escalate, interrupted by the natural lull that made sharp words feel unnecessary. Town records later showed no correlation, but residents spoke of it casually, saying things felt calmer somehow, and then they moved on to discussing weather or repairs or what they planned to cook for dinner. In the museum, visitors rarely came during the nap hour, but when they did, they moved slowly past exhibits, reading plaques with lowered voices, and sometimes sitting on the bench near the display of early tools, closing their eyes as if the past itself required a moment of rest. Outside, the main street held steady, cars parked where they had been left, wind lifting, dust in small, temporary swirls, and storefront windows, reflecting sunlight in a way that changed almost imperceptibly minute by minute. Even the town's calendar of events adjusted without fuss, meetings scheduled around the pause, parades starting a little later, fundraisers ending a little earlier, all of it done quietly, without explanation, because no one needed one. And so the town went on, its history stretching forward not as a line of notable events, but as a broad, even surface, afternoons repeating themselves with gentle reliability, the nap hour arriving and passing whether noticed or not, and life continuing in the calm, unremarkable way it always had. Over time, the town's sense of afternoon became so ingrained that even without clocks people could often tell when 3 was near, not by sound or announcement, but by the way light settled differently on familiar surfaces, by how conversation thinned into pauses, and by the subtle heaviness that came into limbs after lunch. The fire station kept its doors open as usual, engines parked in a neat line, hoses coiled and untouched, and during the nap hour firefighters sat at the long table with mugs cooling in their hands, eyes closed but alert enough that if a call ever did come, which it rarely did at that time, they would rise without confusion. The hardware store smelled of wood shavings and metal, and tools hung in careful rows, unmoved between 2 and 3:30, while the owner rested on a stool behind the counter, one foot hooked around a rung, breathing slow, and even as the ceiling fan traced its steady circle above him. In homes along the quieter streets, mail lay unopened on side tables until later, envelopes warming slightly in the sun, their contents patient and unconcerned with immediacy. The creek at the edge of town continued its shallow movement, water slipping past stones that had been there longer than any ordinance, reflecting the sky in a muted way that made time feel stretched rather than counted, and sometimes someone sitting nearby during the nap hour would drift off with the sound of water, filling the spaces between thoughts. At the clinic, appointment schedules simply skipped that portion of the afternoon, and no one questioned it anymore, the absence of names on the page feeling as intentional as their presence elsewhere. Conversations picked up afterward where they had left off, often with a brief smile or a comment about having lost track of time, which was said without apology and received without expectation. Even the town's few newcomers, who initially noticed the quiet with curiosity, soon found themselves leaning into it, adjusting their own pace until it matched the surrounding calm, discovering that nothing important was lost by resting when the day suggested it. The nap law, still written in careful language in the town code, lived now mostly in memory and habit, referenced only when someone new asked or when an old file was opened, and its pages fluttered slightly in the stirred air. And as afternoons continued to arrive, soften, and pass, the town carried on in its familiar way, routines repeating with small variations, time moving forward gently, without alarms, without urgency, and without any particular reason to mark where one day ended and the next began. As the town's story stretched backward as well as forward, a deeper look into its records revealed that the habit of pausing in the afternoon was not as novel as the ordinance had made it seem, and that the nap law had merely given language to something that had existed in fragments for a very long time. In the county archive, housed in a low brick building that smelled of cardboard and cooled air, there were ledgers from the late 19th century noting midday rest, beside entries about road maintenance and bridge inspections, written in a careful hand that slanted slightly to the right. And these notes were not emphasized or explained, as if the person writing them assumed anyone reading would already understand. Newspaper clippings from the early 1900s mentioned factories that rang bells at noon and again later in the afternoon, allowing workers to sit or lie down briefly in shaded areas, a practice attributed not to benevolence, but to common sense in a time before electric fans were widespread. And these clippings were preserved in scrapbooks assembled by volunteers who took their time, pasting each article carefully, and then resting their hands on the table before moving on to the next. Oral histories recorded on cassette tapes in the 1970s captured older voices, recalling how their parents had once closed shops for a short while after lunch, not as a rule, but as a rhythm dictated by heat and the slow understanding of bodies. And these tapes now sat digitized on a server that quietly in a back room, accessed occasionally by researchers who listened with headphones on, sometimes drifting as the voices themselves drifted, steady and unhurried. Even earlier references appeared indirectly, in journals kept by settlers who wrote of the long pause of the day, when the sun was highest and work felt distant. And though these journals did not use the word nap, the descriptions suggested the same gentle surrender to stillness that the modern town recognized at 3 o'clock. Archaeological surveys conducted decades ago, when a new water line was installed, noted shallow depressions near old foundations that were interpreted as resting areas, places where people might have sat or reclined briefly. And the report mentioned this only in passing, more interested in soil composition than human habit. The deeper the history was traced, the clearer it became that the nap law was less an innovation and more a rediscovery, a formula of a pattern that had quietly repeated itself whenever circumstances allowed. The town council at the time of the ordinance had not cited these histories explicitly, but some members had grown up hearing stories from grandparents who remembered slower days, and their votes, recorded simply as yes, carried that unspoken memory forward. In the present, the practice continued without reference to its origins, yet it aligned neatly with them, as if time itself had folded back on a familiar crease. Researchers who studied the town noted this continuity with mild interest, writing papers that concluded without strong claims, suggesting only that certain communities preserved rhythms that others abandoned, and these papers were read, briefly considered, and then filed away. Meanwhile, at 3 in the afternoon, the town still quieted, sunlight still moved across desks and floors, pens still rested where they had been left, and people still drifted into light sleep, unaware that they were participating in a tradition older than their houses and broader than their own lifetimes. The past lay beneath the present like a slow current under a calm surface, not pulling or urging, only supporting, and the town continued on, carrying its layered history forward in the same unremarkable way it always had, resting briefly in the middle of the day, then rising again, without ceremony, without alarms, and without any need to call attention to itself. As the deeper layers of the town's past settled into a clearer outline, it became evident that what appeared on the surface as a mild civic experiment was in fact an echo of long-established human packing that had survived quietly while names, buildings, and technologies changed around it. Land deeds from the early territorial period, written in ink that had browned with age, showed property boundaries described in relation to rest trees and shade hours, phrases that suggested not landmarks of urgency, but pauses built into daily movement. And these deeds were stored flat in drawers that archivists opened slowly, careful not to disturb the paper more than necessary. Church records from the mid-1800s mentioned afternoon services that were often postponed until later after the rest. And sermons of that era, preserved in handwritten notebooks, were shorter and less emphatic during warmer months, reflecting an understanding that attention itself required periods of retreat. The town's schoolhouse, according to a teacher's diary kept in careful, repetitive entries, dismissed students for a time each afternoon so they could return home and lie down, a practice explained not philosophically, but practically, noting that learning resumed more smoothly afterward, and the diary ended many days with the same phrase written in small, tidy letters: quiet afternoon. Maps from different decades showed how roads curved gently rather than cutting straight through the landscape, following paths that accommodated rest and shade, and surveyors' notes remarked on this with mild curiosity, though they never proposed changing it. In the mid-20th century, as efficiency became a word elsewhere, the town briefly experimented with longer work hours, but meeting notes from that period recorded increased fatigue and slower output, and within a few years schedules drifted back toward their earlier shape, the adjustment noted without commentary, as if the town itself had corrected course. The nap law, when it finally arrived, did so not as a response to crisis, but as a codification of accumulated habit, a way of writing down what had already been practiced in fragments, and once written, it required little attention, because enforcement was unnecessary where memory and comfort aligned. Contemporary researchers who revisited these materials often remarked on the absence of dramatic turning points, observing that the town's endurance lay in its resistance to acceleration rather than in any single event, and their conclusions were modest, suggesting that continuity itself could be a form of adaptation. Back in the present, the archives remained mostly undisturbed, their boxes labeled and stacked, their contents resting much like the town did each afternoon, while outside, the daily rhythm continued to express itself without reference to footnotes or citations. At 3 o'clock, offices softened, homes, public spaces grew quieter, and the town repeated a practice older than its own name, carrying forward a history defined not by what happened, but by what was intentionally allowed to pause. And as the afternoon light continued its slow movement across walls and sidewalks, the town remained steady, letting time pass through it gently, as it always had. The continuation of that history revealed itself not through discoveries that demanded attention, but through confirmations that the town had always behaved much the same way, choosing consistency over novelty whenever the choice presented itself. Tax records from the early 20th century showed that revenue slightly during hours, then rose again later, a pattern noted once by an accountant in the margin with a small penciled line and never discussed again. Minutes from agricultural cooperatives described workdays shaped around heat and rest, with machinery powered down briefly not to save fuel, but to preserve people. And those minutes were written in language so plain that the intention behind them felt almost invisible. In letters exchanged between shop owners decades apart, there were references to that quiet stretch, or the slow part of the day, phrases used without explanation, suggesting a shared understanding that needed no formal definition. Even when federal encouraged productivity metrics and standardized hours, the town, only where necessary, filling out forms correctly while continuing its own internal timing, a dual system that functioned without friction because no one pushed it to change. Oral traditions passed down in families spoke of ancestors who rested in barns or under trees at the height of the day, and while the stories varied in detail, they shared a tone of acceptance, as if rest were not a luxury, but a feature of life that required no justification. The nap law, now decades old, appeared in updated town codes printed on recycled paper, its wording unchanged, and most residents could not recall when they had last read it, though they lived by it daily. New buildings incorporated the pause naturally, offices designed with softer lighting options, schools with storage for mats built into walls, and public spaces with benches placed where shade would fall reliably in. The town never marketed this rhythm or framed it as an identity. It simply continued, and in doing so preserved a way of moving through time that elsewhere had been forgotten or replaced. Researchers who visited often left with notes that were more observational than analytical, describing a place where history did not announce itself, but accumulated gently, and where the most enduring practices were those that allowed people to step briefly out of motion. As the present day settled into the same familiar shape as the days before it, the town carried its layered past forward without ceremony, afternoons still softening at 3, work still resuming afterward without disruption, and life continuing in its steady, unremarkable flow, history deepening not through change, but through repetition that remained calm, reliable, and quietly complete. The longer view of the town's history, when allowed to stretch without pressure or conclusion, revealed a pattern that was less about events and more about endurance, a steady preference for habits that did not exhaust the people who practiced them. Census data taken at regular intervals showed population numbers that rose and fell modestly, never sharply, and annotations in the margins sometimes mentioned seasonal absences or returns, suggesting that people left and came back without drama, carrying the town's pace with them and re-entering it easily when they returned. Diaries kept by residents across generations, many donated quietly to the Historical Society and stored in labeled boxes, often contained long gaps between entries, not because nothing had happened, but because nothing had seemed necessary to record. And when entries did appear, they described weather, meals, repairs, and the dependable quiet of, with the same even tone used year after year. The local railroad spur, once active and later abandoned, showed in its operating schedules a built-in lull during the part of the day, and when the tracks were eventually removed, the path they left behind became a walking trail where people still paused naturally at 3, sitting on old ties repurposed as benches, unaware they were resting in the same place others had paused long before. Economic reports written during periods of national urgency noted that the town met expectations without exceeding them, a phrase repeated often enough to become almost affectionate, and analysts commented briefly on the town's resistance to overtime culture, attributing it to tradition rather than policy. The Knapp law, by then an accepted, was occasionally referenced in academic writing as an example of localized temporal governance, though the tone of those papers was subdued, acknowledging that the town's success lay not in innovation, but in its refusal to hurry. Schools taught local history in short units that emphasized continuity, and students learned that their town had survived not by expanding aggressively or reinventing itself, but by maintaining a steady internal rhythm that allowed people to remain attentive without strain. Architectural surveys noted that buildings were designed with deeper porches, narrower windows on the west side, and interior spaces that cooled naturally, all features that supported rest during the day, and these designs persisted even as styles changed, incorporated quietly into newer structures without comment. The town's medical records, reviewed retrospectively, showed lower incidences of stress-related complaints compared to neighboring areas, a fact mentioned cautiously by practitioners who preferred not to draw sweeping conclusions, and patients themselves rarely attributed their health to anything specific, simply saying they felt fine. At 3 each afternoon, this accumulated history expressed itself without words, in the way conversation slowed, in the way hands paused mid-task, in the way light was allowed to pass across rooms without being interrupted by movement. The law that once required naps no longer felt like a law at all, but rather like a description of what the town already was, written down only so it would not be forgotten. Time continued to pass, years layering gently over one another, and the town's history grew longer not by becoming more complex, but by remaining consistently simple, allowing each day to resemble the last just enough that people felt held by it, resting briefly in the middle of their hours, then continuing on, calm and unhurried, into whatever came next. The continuation of that history did not require new evidence so much as patience, because the town's story revealed itself only when observed over a long enough span to notice how little it insisted on being noticed. Annual reports from the utility company showed steady usage curves that at the same point each afternoon, a small trough in electricity and water, demand that engineers initially attributed to coincidence, until it repeated year after year with such regularity that it became part of their baseline expectations, noted once in a technical appendix, and then accepted without further comment. Weather logs kept at the edge of town by a volunteer observer recorded temperatures, cloud cover, and wind with consistent care, and in the margins there were occasional remarks about the quality of the light at 3 p.m. Not poetic, just factual, noting how it softened or flattened depending on the season, as if the observer had come to understand that this was the hour when the day briefly folded in on itself. Local businesses changed hands over time, owners retiring or passing them on to children or employees, and each transition was marked by small adjustments that preserved the afternoon pause, stools kept behind counters, lights wired to dim easily, schedules written with a blank space in the middle that no one needed to label. Town planners, when asked years later why certain streets were designed with extra shade trees or why public buildings included rooms that served no obvious purpose, often answered that this was simply how it had always been done, an explanation that satisfied most inquiries because it contained no argument. Even moments of broader historical significance passed through the town with little disturbance, marked by flags adjusted on porches, radios tuned briefly to the news, and conversations that acknowledged events and then returned to ordinary matters, the nap hour remaining intact, neither postponed nor emphasized. Personal histories mirrored this collective steadiness. People married, raised children, lost loved ones, and marked these changes quietly, often gathering in the afternoon when voices were already low and movements restrained, finding comfort in the predictability of the hour. The town's cemetery, maintained with regular care, showed rows of stones bearing dates that spanned centuries, and visitors often noticed how many epitaphs mentioned peace, rest, or simply named the person without commentary, as if the absence of explanation were itself a form of respect. Over time, scholars who revisited the town's records began to describe its history not as static, but as gently self-correcting, a system that absorbed pressures and released them through routine rather than reaction, and their language reflected the difficulty of analyzing something that refused to dramatize itself. Meanwhile, the daily practice continued, unaffected by interpretation. At 3 o'clock, offices grew quiet, homes, public spaces settled, and the accumulated weight of years expressed itself in the simplest possible way, through a shared pause that asked nothing and demanded nothing. The town carried on, its history extending forward with the same calm assurance that had shaped its past, allowing time to pass through it evenly, one unremarkable afternoon at a time. The American character of the town's history became clearer the longer it was allowed to remain unadorned, because it reflected a national tendency that often went unnoticed, the habit of building lives around practical comfort rather than declared philosophy. Federal census takers passed through at regular intervals, knocking politely on doors in the morning or early evening, never at 3, because even outsiders quickly learned that the middle of the afternoon was not a productive time for questions, and their forms recorded occupations, ages, and household sizes with neat boxes that captured nothing of the pause itself, even though it shaped everything around it. Highway improvements skirted the town rather than cutting through it, a routing decision justified by cost and geography, but residents appreciated the resulting quiet, which preserved the slow afternoons without ever having to say so aloud. During wartime periods, rationing notices were posted on bulletin boards and store windows, read carefully, and then left in place during the nap hour when no one stood before them, the paper curling slightly at the edges as the sun warmed it. And compliance came not from urgency but from habit, from doing what was asked in the same steady way everything else was done. Veterans returned and resumed work without ceremony, finding that the afternoon rest eased the transition back into ordinary schedules. And though no reports linked the two, families noticed privately that the pause helped people settle back into routine. The town's factories modernized slowly, replacing equipment one piece at a time, and managers discovered that productivity remained consistent even with the daily lull, reinforcing the local belief that constant motion was not the same as effective work. Public schools followed state curricula while quietly preserving the afternoon calm, lesson plans bending gently around it, and inspectors noted orderly classrooms without remarking on the brief stillness that preceded the final lessons of the day. National holidays were observed with flags and parades that moved at an unhurried pace, often scheduled to avoid the nap hour entirely, not by rule but by preference, because everyone understood that rest was not something to interrupt lightly. Over decades, the town appeared in reports and surveys as average, stable, and unexceptional, descriptors that suited it well, and those who lived there accepted them without protest, understanding that endurance rarely announces itself loudly. The Knapp law, unchanged and rarely cited, sat alongside zoning codes and parking regulations in printed volumes that rested on shelves, opened occasionally, then closed again, their presence reassuring rather than directive. And so the town's boring American history continued, not marked by bold declarations or defining moments, but by a quiet consistency that carried it through years of national change. Afternoons still softening at the same point on the clock, people still pausing without alarms, and life proceeding calmly, predictably, and without any pressing need to become more than it already was. The continuation of this American history remained firmly rooted in the ordinary, the kind that fills filing cabinets and kitchen calendars rather than monuments, and if someone tried to summarize it, they would likely pause and then decide there was nothing that required summarizing. Utility poles were replaced one by one over the years, never all at once, and crews learned to schedule their work around the afternoon pause, sitting in trucks with windows down at 3, hard hats back, the radio low, waiting without impatience because waiting had long since become part of the job. The public library expanded slightly, adding a quiet room that was technically meant for study, but was most often used during the nap hour by people who set their bags down, leaned back, and closed their eyes beneath a sign reminding patrons to silence their phones, a reminder that felt redundant in the stillness. Local elections continued to draw steady but modest turnout, polling places opening early and closing before evening, and at 3 the booths stood empty, pencils resting beside ballots, volunteers seated with thermoses cooling, the democratic process pausing without consequence. Farming just outside town followed the same rhythm, machinery shut down briefly in the afternoon, not because crops demanded it, but because people did, and the fields lay quiet under the sun, rows unchanging, wind passing over them without disturbance. Newspapers shrank further, then shifted online, And even there, the town's digital activity logs showed a dip in clicks at the familiar hour, a modern trace of an old habit, data analysts noting the pattern without assigning it meaning. Repair shops kept handwritten appointment books long after software was available, pages smudged with grease and pencil marks, and at 3 the books lay open where they had been left, appointments resuming afterward without confusion. Families marked time through routines rather than events, children growing taller, adults growing slower, elders sitting longer on porches in the afternoon, all of it unfolding with a consistency that felt reliable rather than dull. National news cycled through crises and recoveries, heard faintly through radios or televisions turned low, absorbed without the town's internal packing, because the afternoon rest remained untouched, a small boundary that nothing seemed urgent enough to cross. Historians who later categorized the town placed it firmly in the middle of the American experience, knotting stability, continuity, and adaptation without disruption, terms that appeared repeatedly in reports and surveys. And so the town persisted, its history continuing not through moments that demanded attention, but through days that resembled one another closely enough to feel safe, afternoons still slowing at 3, people still pausing without instruction, and time moving forward in the most unremarkable way possible, which was exactly how the town preferred it. As the decades extended themselves further, the town's American history continued to resemble a long, even road with no sharp turns, the kind of road where drivers ease off the accelerator without consciously deciding to do so. Municipal budgets balanced themselves year after year with minor adjustments. A line item shifted here, a small increase there, and the nap hour remained unaffected, listed simply as part of operating schedules, its cost calculated as negligible and its benefit never. The courthouse clock was serviced periodically, its mechanism cleaned and oiled by a specialist who visited every few years, and each time the clock resumed its steady marking of hours, striking 3 with the same mild authority it always had, a sound that blended into the afternoon rather than interrupting it. In living rooms, furniture was rearranged occasionally, sofas replaced, rugs rolled out or taken away, yet people still found the same spot to sit or lie down when the day softened, bodies remembering comfort even when surroundings changed. The town's high school graduations came and went, ceremonies held in the evening when the nap hour had long passed, and speeches emphasized responsibility and opportunity without mentioning rest, though many graduates later admitted that the habit of pausing had stayed with them, guiding their workdays in subtle ways wherever they went. Retail trends shifted nationally, chains opening and closing, but the town absorbed these changes slowly. Storefronts repurposed without hurry, signs replaced with minimal fuss, interiors adjusted so that lights could dim naturally in the afternoon. Maintenance logs for public buildings showed predictable patterns of wear, hinges tightened, carpets cleaned, paint refreshed, all noted in calm handwriting, and often the notes included timestamps that skipped neatly over the 3 o'clock hour. Community groups met regularly, discussing gardens, historical markers, or holiday decorations, and meetings often paused mid-discussion when the time arrived, members leaning back, conversations trailing off not because a rule demanded it, but because the room itself seemed to suggest quiet. Even emergencies, when they occurred, were rare enough that they stood out precisely because they broke the pattern, and afterward the town returned to its rhythm quickly, as if correcting a brief imbalance. The nap law remained unchanged through revisions of municipal code, its language growing older on the page, while its practice stayed fresh in daily life. Histories written later described the town as steady, average, resilient, words that carried little drama but much accuracy, and readers sometimes found these accounts dull, unaware that the dullness itself was the point. And so the American history of the town continued to unfold in this understated way. Afternoons still slowing at 3, people still resting without alarms or urgency, and time continuing forward calmly, supported by routine rather than driven by ambition. The town content to remain exactly as it was, day after unremarkable day. The story carried on because there was no reason for it to stop, and the town itself never signaled an ending, only a continuation that felt natural and expected. Historical markers placed along the outskirts of town remained modest in size and wording, stating facts without interpretation, and visitors who read them often moved on without lingering, leaving the plaques to warm quietly in the afternoon sun at 3 o'clock when no one stood before them. Infrastructure projects appeared in local headlines from time to time, bridge inspections completed, sidewalks repaired, water lines updated, all reported in language that emphasized completion dates and funding sources rather than impact. And these projects were scheduled with the same consideration for the afternoon pause, crews packing up briefly, equipment silent, work resuming afterward without delay. Churches adjusted service times slightly over the years, choirs agging and replenishing, hymnals replaced when bindings wore out, and during weekday afternoons sanctuaries remained empty and still, pews holding the quiet the way they had for generations. Town festivals came and went on predictable schedules, food booths, folding chairs, and music played at a volume that never overwhelmed conversation. And even these events slowed in the afternoon, vendors sitting behind tables, hands folded, waiting comfortably for the day to pick up again. School curricula updated with state requirements, textbooks revised, classrooms modernized, yet teachers continued to recognize that attention waned after lunch and structured lessons accordingly, the nap hour fitting easily into educational planning without ever being mentioned in policy documents. Real estate listings described homes as solid, well-kept, and quiet, rarely mentioning the nap law directly, though buyers soon learned that afternoons here felt different, softer, less insistent, and most accepted this without question. Demographic shifts occurred gradually, older residents downsizing, younger families moving in, and the town absorbed these changes without its pace, the afternoon rest remaining a shared experience that required no explanation across age or background. Even technological updates followed this pattern. Software installed overnight, systems rebooted early in the morning, nothing scheduled for the middle of the day when the town expected stillness. Historians reviewing this period later described it as stable to the point of invisibility, a long stretch where nothing disrupted the underlying rhythm, and their footnotes were sparse because there was little that demanded citation. And so the American history of the town continued, recorded in meeting minutes, utility logs, personal routines, and unremarkable afternoons, the nap law blending fully into everyday life, no longer distinct from it, as time moved forward steadily, predictably, and without urgency, the town resting briefly each day and then continuing on, exactly as it always had. The history kept extending not because anyone added to it deliberately, but because each day simply arrived and took its place among the others, indistinguishable except for small, personal details that rarely made it into any official record. Insurance maps were updated every few years, shifting slightly to reflect new materials or revised classifications, and the blocks of the town remained largely the same shape, their outlines steady and familiar. And if someone spread one of these maps out on a table during the afternoon, the paper would lie flat and warm, corners barely lifting as the room settled into the quiet of 3 o'clock. Public Works reports noted tree trimming cycles, sewer maintenance, and street resurfacing, all carried out on rotating schedules that avoided the nap hour as naturally as one avoids walking through a room where someone is sleeping. and the language of these reports was calm and technical, offering reassurance through predictability rather than detail. The town's banks merged and rebranded once or twice. Signs replaced logos, and inside the buildings the counters stayed in the same place. The chairs remained along the walls, and customers still found themselves sitting quietly in the afternoon, forms resting on their laps, pens uncapped but unmoving for a few minutes at a time. Family histories continued to overlap in modest ways, cousins marrying into other long-established families, last names repeating on mailboxes and in yearbooks, and photo albums accumulating slowly, their pages turned infrequently, often during the quieter hours of the day when the light was good and no one felt rushed. Weather events passed through with varying degrees of notice: a heavy rain, an early frost, a long summer stretch of heat, all recorded in logs and remembered in conversation for a while before settling into the background. And even then the nap hour remained consistent, rain softening sound even further, heat encouraging stillness, cold drawing people inward to couches and chairs where blankets waited. The town's small airport, used mostly for crop dusters and private planes, showed flight logs with a noticeable lull in the middle of the afternoon, pilots planning around it not because of regulation, but because the air itself seemed calmer then, and the waiting room lights stayed dim, chairs aligned neatly, no announcements breaking the quiet. Local courts handled minor disputes and routine matters, dockets filled and cleared with methodical efficiency, and hearings were never scheduled for 3 o'clock, an unwritten rule that clerks followed without discussion, leaving courtrooms empty for a short while each day, sunlight touching the wood of benches and railings where people had sat earlier. The town's radio station, a low-power AM signal, continued broadcasting familiar programming, and at 3 it shifted to softer music or rebroadcasts, the announcer's voice dropping slightly in volume, words spaced out comfortably, as if aware that listeners might be drifting in and out of sleep. Community surveys conducted occasionally asked residents about satisfaction, safety, and services, and responses clustered around neutral to positive, with handwritten comments noting things like quiet, steady, and no complaints, phrases that appeared often enough to form a pattern of their own. Historical preservation efforts focused on maintenance rather than restoration, keeping buildings usable rather than frozen in time, repainting trim, repairing roofs, replacing worn steps, all done with an eye toward continuity rather than display. The town museum rotated exhibits slowly, sometimes leaving the same display up for years, and visitors came rarely during the afternoon, preferring mornings or early evenings, leaving the space hushed and still at 3, resting behind glass without anyone watching. Sports leagues continued season after season, practices held later in the day, fields empty during the nap hour, grass undisturbed, goalposts casting long shadows that shifted gradually as the sun moved. Economic changes arrived indirectly, through notices of price adjustments, supply delays, or new regulations, and businesses adapted with minimal commentary, chalkboards updated, shelves rearranged, routines adjusted slightly, the nap hour unaffected. The town's relationship with time itself remained practical rather than philosophical, clocks maintained, calendars marked, appointments kept, and yet there was always this agreed-upon softness in the middle of the day when precision gave way to rest. Children learned early that afternoons slowed naturally. Pets learned it too, dogs curling up in familiar spots, cats choosing the same warm windowsills, the entire town seeming to exhale at once. As the years went on, historians attempting to capture this period often struggled to find a narrative hook, noting instead the absence of disruption, the persistence of routine, and the quiet success of a place that did not seek distinction. Their writing reflected this, sentences steady and unadorned, conclusions cautious, acknowledging that some histories resist summary because they are defined by repetition rather than change. And through all of it, the Knapp law remained, unchanged in text, softened in practice, woven so completely into daily life that it no longer stood out as policy at all, but simply as the way afternoons were lived. Time continued forward in this manner, one calm, ordinary day after another, the town resting briefly at 3, then rising again without effort, carrying its long, boring American history onward in the only way it knew how, quietly, steadily, and without any urgency to become something else. The continuation followed the same dependable path, because nothing in the town ever suggested a need for departure from it, and history here behaved less like a record of change and more like a ledger of steady maintenance. Annual safety inspections came and went, clipboards carried through buildings, boxes checked in careful handwriting, and inspectors learned quickly that the quiet at 3 was not an inconvenience but a pause to be respected. So they sat in parked cars or empty offices, engines off, notes unfinished, waiting calmly for the day to resume. The town's water tower was repainted once, its faded lettering refreshed to match the original as closely as possible, and during the afternoon pause, the painters descended ladders and rested on the grass, hats low, watching clouds move slowly enough to seem almost fixed in place. In kitchens across town, recipes were followed from memory rather than instruction. Soups simmered gently, ovens cooled slightly during the nap hour, and meals waited without complaint, understanding that nothing important was lost by delay. School reunions occurred every decade, graduates returning with softened expectations, gathering in gyms or community centers decorated with folding tables and old photographs, and conversations often drifted into silence around, people sitting together without pressure to speak, the same stillness they remembered from childhood. Town newsletters continued to be printed and mailed, their tone steady and factual, and at 3 p.m. delivery trucks sat idle, stacks of envelopes waiting patiently in back rooms. Local roads were resurfaced incrementally, one stretch at a time, orange cones placed carefully and then removed, and drivers learned that if they were delayed by 15 minutes in the afternoon, it was no trouble at all. Health clinics updated equipment and procedures, adopting new standards while preserving older habits that worked just as well, and waiting rooms grew quiet at the same hour each day, magazines left open to half-read articles, pages unmoving. The town's small screened films on weekends, matinees scheduled earlier and evening shows later, and the empty auditorium during the nap hour held a stillness that felt intentional, seats facing the blank screen as if waiting. Volunteer organizations rotated leadership without conflict, meeting agendas unchanged, minutes recorded faithfully, and during the afternoon pause, meetings simply stopped where they were, conversation resuming later without the need to recap. Utility bills were paid on time, checks mailed or payments submitted online, and customer service lines showed a predictable drop in calls at 3. Representatives leaning back in chairs, headsets resting on desks, screens glowing softly. The town cemetery expanded gradually, new plots added along the edges, and maintenance crews trimmed grass in the morning, leaving the grounds undisturbed in the afternoon, headstones warming in the sun, names resting quietly where they had been placed. Even celebrations adjusted naturally, birthdays marked earlier or later in the day, cakes waiting on counters, candles unlit until the pause passed. Through all of this, no one made speeches about the value of rest or framed it as a principle to be defended. It simply existed as part of the environment, like weather or daylight, shaping without instruction. Historical studies that mentioned the town often did so briefly, noting its stability and lack of volatility, and then moved on to places where events happened and louder. Meanwhile here, the afternoon continued to arrive each day with the same gentle certainty, and the town continued to respond in the same way, slowing, settling, and then carrying on. Years accumulated, records filled shelves, people came and went, and still the pattern held, the nap hour blending fully into the background of American life as lived in this place. Time passed without urgency, afternoons softened as they always had, and the town continued forward, not striving toward anything in particular, but maintaining what it already knew how to be, quietly, steadily, and without interruption. The history kept lengthening in this unremarkable fashion, each additional year fitting neatly into the existing pattern without adjustment or explanation. Federal grants came through occasionally for infrastructure or community, applications filled out correctly and submitted on time, approvals received weeks later, and implementation schedules drawn up that naturally avoided the middle of the afternoon, as if planners everywhere sensed that this was not a time meant for decisions or disruption. Town employees retired after long service, farewell notices printed in the paper with polite appreciation, positions filled quietly by people who learned the routines quickly, including when to stop moving for a while and let the day settle. The municipal garage replaced its trucks gradually, one agging vehicle traded in every few years, and mechanics noted that engines lasted longer when they were allowed a daily cooling period, an observation mentioned casually and never formally studied. Local businesses continue to adjust to broader economic shifts in small, careful ways, changing suppliers, revising prices slightly, shortening or lengthening hours by narrow margins. And still the afternoon pause remained untouched, a fixed point around which everything else revolved. Seasonal decorations appeared and disappeared on schedule, flags raised and lowered, wreaths hung and stored, and at 3 o'clock the streets often looked temporarily unfinished. Ladders left where they stood, boxes unopened, because work would resume soon enough. Mail order gave way to online shopping, packages arriving at doorsteps in the morning or early evening, delivery vans conspicuously absent during the nap hour, drivers taking breaks in shaded lots, scrolling idly or closing their eyes. Town ordinances were reviewed periodically for relevance, outdated language updated, references modernized, and each time the nap law passed through the process unchanged, deemed current and effective, though few could say precisely why, other than that it still worked. The Planning Commission reviewed proposals for new housing or small commercial spaces, approving designs that fit existing patterns, setbacks consistent, heights modest, and windows placed to admit light without glare. All considerations that supported the town's unspoken preference for calm afternoons. The fire department conducted drills early in the day, sirens tested briefly and then silenced, equipment checked and put away, leaving the station quiet by, doors open, air moving slowly through the bay. Public opinion surveys continued to show high levels of satisfaction with quality of life, a phrase that appeared often but was rarely unpacked, and interviews conducted by visiting journalists tended to end early, conversations drifting, subjects glancing at the clock and smiling when 3 approached. The journalists wrote pieces describing a town where not much happened, and readers skimmed them, missing the point entirely. Over time, the town became an example cited in footnotes rather than headlines, a case study in continuity rather than change. Personal milestones accumulated in family Bibles and digital photo albums, births, graduations, weddings, losses, all recorded with care, and many of these moments were remembered in connection with the quiet of the afternoon. Visits made then, conversations held in lowered voices, grief and joy alike softened by the shared stillness. Pets aged and were replaced, gardens were planted and replanted, fences repaired, roofs reshingled, all work done with the understanding that nothing needed to be rushed. Even traffic patterns reflected this, intersections nearly empty at 3, lights cycling through for no one in particular. And so the town's boring American history continued to write itself in this manner, through maintenance rather than transformation, through repetition rather than revelation. The nap hour remained an anchor, not because anyone insisted on it, but because it fit so well into the shape of the day that removing it would have required effort. Time went on, quietly and reliably, afternoons still slowing at the same moment, people still pausing without alarms or enforcement, and the town continued forward exactly as it always had, calm, ordinary, and entirely content to remain so. The continuation required no announcement, because in this town nothing ever truly began or ended, it simply carried on, and the days kept arranging themselves into the same dependable shape. Utility bills arrived in envelopes that were opened later, checks written, or online payments scheduled without urgency, and the envelopes stacked neatly on desks during the afternoon pause, their contents patient. The public works yard accumulated spare parts and tools labeled in block letters, shelves reorganized once every few years, and at 3 the space settled into stillness, radios turned down, workers sitting on overturned buckets or benches, letting the heat pass and their thoughts thin out. The town's annual audit was completed on time each cycle, numbers reviewed, discrepancies minor, and resolved quickly, and the final report always concluded with language that suggested stability rather than growth, a conclusion that satisfied everyone involved. Local restaurants updated menus occasionally, prices changing by small increments, fonts modernized slightly, yet the dishes remained familiar, and during the nap hour kitchens grew quieter, burners turned low, staff leaning against counters, waiting comfortably for the evening rush that always came later. Street sweepers passed through neighborhoods early in the day, leaving curbs clean, and by the streets lay undisturbed, leaves and dust settled where they landed. The town's small insurance office kept detailed records of claims that were mostly minor, fences repaired, roofs patched, accidents resolved without dispute, and the phones rang less at 3, allowing staff to rest their voices and their attention. Seasonal illnesses came and went, clinics adjusted schedules, pharmacies filled prescriptions efficiently, and waiting rooms that held a subdued calm, chairs occupied but quiet, people closing their eyes without embarrassment. The town's zoning maps were revised once to reflect minor boundary changes, lines with precision, and planners noted that no variances were requested that affected the afternoon pause, a detail that went unrecorded but was quietly appreciated. Farmers' markets operated on Saturday mornings, vendors packing up well before 3, leaving the square empty and sunlit in the afternoon, tables folded, chalkboard signs erased halfway. Local banks updated security systems, cameras replaced, software upgraded, and training sessions scheduled in the morning hours, leaving afternoons free, teller windows empty, pens lined up neatly. The town's volunteer fire auxiliary met monthly, attendance steady, agendas short, and meetings often ended early when the clock approached 3, members lingering briefly and then heading home to rest. Neighborhood associations handled concerns about fences, pets, or noise with polite notes and calm conversations, many of them happening in the late afternoon when voices were already softened by the shared understanding that nothing needed to escalate. Over time, the town's pace influenced those who stayed long enough, newcomers learning quickly that there was no reward for rushing, and that productivity here meant consistency rather than speed. Children raised in this environment learn to fill quiet time without restlessness, sitting with books, out windows, or simply lying on the floor watching light move across the ceiling. The town's relationship with time remained practical and unspoken. Clocks consulted, but not obeyed too strictly. Calendars marked, but not crowded. Historical essays written about this period tended to describe it as uneventful, sometimes apologetically, and readers seeking drama turned away, unaware that the value lay precisely in the absence of it. The nap law remained in place, unchanged, unchallenged, and increasingly invisible, a background condition like gravity, shaping without needing recognition. And so the town continued, its boring American history extending forward through ordinary afternoons, the pause at 3 still arriving, people still resting without instruction, and life proceeding steadily, calmly, and without any urgency to become something else. The history went on unfolding in the same way a long afternoon stretches when no one is watching the clock too closely, each moment slipping into the next without resistance. Town vehicles were in maintenance binders with dates and mileages written carefully in pen, and the binders grew thicker while the handwriting stayed much the same. And at 3 in the afternoon, those books lay open on desks where sunlight reached the margins and stopped, as if even the light understood where to pause. The public access television station continued broadcasting council meetings, school concerts, and gardening tips, and during the nap hour the screen often showed a static image of the town's seal or a quietly looping announcement, the signal steady, unhurried, waiting for attention that might or might not return. At the edge of town, grain silos stood unchanged, their metal sides warming through the day and cooling again at night, and farmers who passed by them knew without checking the time when it was close to 3, because that was when the road felt emptier and the air seemed thicker, pressing gently against movement. Insurance adjusters, delivery coordinators, and regional managers learned over time that calls placed in would likely go unanswered, not out of neglect, but out of habit, and they adjusted their expectations accordingly, penciling in other tasks and returning later with no sense of inconvenience. The town's rhythm quietly trained anyone who dealt with it regularly, shaping schedules beyond its borders without ever asking permission. Civic pride expressed itself in maintenance rather than expansion. Flagpoles straightened, paint touched up, plaques cleaned, and all of it done without ceremony. When the old courthouse steps were repaired, the stonework matched the original closely enough that most people did not notice the difference. And during the repair days, the work stopped reliably each afternoon, tools set down in the same places, ladders left leaning, the project stretching out slightly longer than planned, but finishing well enough. The town accepted such timelines easily, understanding that completion mattered more than speed. Household routines remained consistent, laundry done in the morning or evening, dishes left soaking through the nap hour, phones placed face down, notifications ignored without effort. Elderly residents sat near windows at 3, eyes closed but minds calm, listening to familiar sounds of the house settling, while younger adults discovered that a brief rest made the second half of the day feel less sharp, though they rarely articulated this insight. Children learned that afternoons contained a natural quiet and adapted their play accordingly, choosing quieter games or simply lying still, watching dust float through sunbeams without asking why. Even the town's emergency alert system reflected this pattern. Tests scheduled for mornings, never afternoons, sirens remaining silent at 3, leaving only the ambient sounds of wind, distant traffic, and the occasional door closing softly. Local charities coordinated drives and fundraisers efficiently, sorting donations early in the day, stacking boxes neatly, and leaving them untouched during the pause, trusting that nothing would spoil by waiting. The town's accountants closed their books monthly, numbers balancing without drama, and reports were filed on time, the dates skipping neatly over the afternoon hour. As years layered themselves quietly, the nap law remained present, but unnecessary to mention, a written confirmation of something already understood. New residents absorbed it naturally, residents barely noticed it, and visitors remembered it only as a vague impression that afternoons there felt different, slower, easier. No plaques commemorated it, no anniversaries marked its passage, and no one suggested changing it, because there was nothing about it that felt imposed. The town's history continued in this manner, a steady accumulation of ordinary days, maintained rather than directed, shaped by habit rather than intention. At 3 each afternoon, the town still softened, work paused without announcement, and people rested briefly in whatever way suited them. And when the hour passed, they rose and continued, carrying forward a boring American history defined not by what happened, but by how calmly everything was allowed to keep happening. The continuation remained faithful to that same calm arrangement, because nothing ever arrived that required a different response, and the town had grown accustomed to letting time do most of the work on its own. Mailboxes were replaced when hinges wore out, new ones installed in nearly the same spots as the old, and at 3 in the afternoon the lids stayed closed, letters inside waiting without consequence. Utility crews updated meters gradually, one house at a time, data collected efficiently in the morning, handheld devices resting unused in the afternoon as technicians sat in their trucks, windows open, listening to nothing in particular. The town's recycling adjusted its guidelines occasionally, bins changing, pamphlets printed and distributed, and the pamphlets lay unread on kitchen counters during the nap hour, corners curling slightly in the warmth. Local contractors scheduled estimates and site visits around the pause, knowing instinctively that knocking on doors at 3 would lead only to delayed answers or soft apologies, and they found this agreeable, using the time to eat sandwiches slowly or review notes without distraction. The town's credit union held financial literacy workshops that ended before, folding chairs stacked neatly afterward, the room settling into stillness as if it had completed its purpose for the day. Seasonal workers came and went, adjusting quickly to the rhythm, remarking once or twice on the quiet, and then adopting it themselves without further comment. Roadside ditches were cleared annually, grass cut back, debris removed, and crews packed up early enough that by 3 the roadsides lay undisturbed, birds returning, wind moving freely through the grass. The town's website was updated periodically, announcements posted, meeting agendas uploaded, and analytics showed a predictable dip in traffic every afternoon, a modern confirmation of an old pattern. Teachers graded papers in the morning or evening, stacks left untouched, red pens resting where they had been set down, comments half-written and completed later without confusion. Medical supply deliveries arrived on regular schedules, boxes unpacked and shelved, inventory counted, and at 3 the supply rooms remained exactly as they were. No hands reaching for anything, labels facing outward, order preserved through inactivity. The town's few lawyers scheduled consultations accordingly, finding that clients were more relaxed and more thoughtful outside the pause, and legal matters proceeded without strain. Even the town's pets seemed to understand the rhythm, dogs curling up automatically, cats abandoning play for warm surfaces, birds quieting briefly in the trees. Local folklore never elevated the nap law to legend, but it appeared occasionally in anecdotes told without emphasis, a background detail in stories about childhood or work, mentioned the way one might mention weather without expecting a reaction. The town's planners reviewed long-term projections, population estimates, infrastructure lifespan, and found no urgent needs, timelines extending comfortably into the future, milestones spaced far apart. Emergency preparedness binders were updated annually, plans rehearsed, drills completed, and then set aside, afternoons left undisturbed. As the years continued, the town's history remained resistant to summary because it did not move toward anything in particular, and that resistance became its defining feature. Researchers who returned after long absences found things mostly unchanged. Familiar faces older, familiar buildings maintained, familiar habits intact. The nap hour still arrived each day without announcement, without enforcement, and without fail, and the town still responded in the same collective way, slowing, settling, resting briefly. Time passed, quietly and evenly, afternoons repeating with minor variations in light and weather, and the town continued to live its boring American history exactly as it always had, through maintenance rather than ambition, through habit rather than intention, allowing each day to become part of a long, uninterrupted stretch of calm, where nothing needed to happen quickly and nothing was required to end. The history continued, because there was nothing in it that resisted continuation, and the town settled into each new year the way it settled into each afternoon, by easing rather than deciding. Property assessments were updated on a rotating schedule, numbers adjusted slightly to reflect wear and age, and the notices were mailed out in plain envelopes that sat unopened on kitchen counters during the quiet hours, addressed later with the same calm attention as everything else. The town's volunteer boards rotated membership slowly, terms, replacements nominated without contest, meetings conducted with agendas that rarely changed. And when three arrived, pens were set down mid-sentence and conversation simply paused, resuming later without anyone needing to repeat what had already been said. Local clinics adopted new record systems over time, screens replacing folders, passwords replacing keys, and yet the lull remained visible even in digital timestamps, activity logs showing gaps that required no explanation. The town's single movie rental kiosk was removed 1 year, replaced by nothing in particular, the empty space left open for a while, then landscaped with shrubs that required little care. And during the nap hour the area lay still, leaves unmoving, gravel warm under the sun. Neighborhood sidewalks were repaired in sections, fresh concrete poured and left to cure, and orange barriers stood quietly at 3, work crews gone for a short rest, the wet surfaces reflecting light without disturbance. Small disputes were resolved through conversation rather than procedure, neighbors speaking across fences or at kitchen tables, voices low, issues addressed without escalation, often during late afternoons when the day already encouraged patience. Town ordinances were amended occasionally to clarify language or remove obsolete references, but the nap law remained untouched, its phrasing agging gently, words carrying the soft authority of familiarity rather than enforcement. Local newspapers continued to publish obituaries written in a restrained style, listing dates, names, and simple remembrances, and families often gathered in the afternoon, sitting together quietly, letting the shared stillness do more than conversation could. Seasonal rhythms layered themselves over the daily pause without conflict, winter shortening the light, summer stretching it, and at 3 the quality of the afternoon changed, but they remained the same. Snowstorms brought silence earlier, heat waves encouraged longer rests, rain softened sound further, and the town adapted without comment. Infrastructure upgrades came with grant deadlines and compliance requirements, forms completed correctly, inspections passed, and still no work was scheduled for the middle of the day unless absolutely necessary, and even then it was done slowly, with apology. Local schools updated technology labs and security protocols, yet preserved older habits that worked, including the understanding that attention waned after lunch and needed space to recover. Students carried this understanding forward, not as doctrine, but as instinct, finding later in life that they worked better when they allowed themselves to pause. Employers noticed, but rarely articulated it, simply accepting that productivity here followed a different curve. The town's archives continued to grow, boxes labeled and shelved, digital backups created, metadata entered carefully, and archivists worked methodically, stopping, hands resting on keyboards, screens dimming automatically. Visitors who wandered in during that time often assumed the building was closed and turned away quietly, not realizing it was simply resting. The town did not correct them. And so the American history of the place extended further into itself, day after day, year after year, built not from events but from intervals, not from urgency but from allowance. At 3 o'clock each afternoon, the town continued to soften as it always had, movements slowing, attention loosening, nothing demanded, nothing enforced. When the hour passed, people resumed what they had been doing, tools lifted, conversations continued, tasks completed in due course. Time moved forward calmly, predictably, and without emphasis, and the town remained exactly what it had always been, a quiet accumulation of ordinary days, resting briefly in the middle of each one, and continuing on without any need to explain itself. In the end, there was no single moment that announced itself as the last. No bell rung, no meeting called, no sentence written in a ledger to say that the story had reached its conclusion, because the town never believed in endings so much as continuations that slowly grew quieter. One afternoon followed another, light shifting across the same rooms, the same streets, the same unremarkable objects resting where they had always rested. And at 3 o'clock the town still softened without instruction, chairs accepting weight, clocks continuing their steady work, papers remaining exactly where they had been left. People rested as they always had, not thinking about laws or history or meaning, only about the gentle relief of doing nothing for a little while. And when the pause passed, they rose without urgency and carried on, cooking dinner, closing shops, turning lights on as evening came. The nap law no longer felt like something that had been passed or remembered or forgotten. It simply existed as part of the air and the light and the way time behaved here. And so the town continued forward, calm and ordinary, its days blending together into a long, even stretch, nothing resolved, nothing demanded, time moving on steadily as it always had, with the afternoon still arriving, the pause still happening, and life continuing quietly, without any particular reason to stop. This mysterious journey ends here, but stay tuned for more untold stories in our next video. Subscribe to the channel and hit the bell icon so you don't miss any new stories.